You're listening to the 2018 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers Program. This session features Dr. Helen Heath and Dr. Jo Cribb in conversation with Naomi Arnold. Kia ora everyone, welcome to Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers. My name is Kerry Sunderland and I'm the coordinator of the program, and it's my great pleasure really just to hand over to today's panel. Naomi Arnold will introduce the other panellists. Please enjoy the session. You can have time for questions towards the end, and afterwards you'll be able to come up and have a look at the books and chat to the authors and get them to sign copies if you buy one. A big thank you to our sponsor, Page and Blackmore, and enjoy the session. I think it's going to be lots of fun. I can't wait to see what this little object down here is going to do.
Thanks, Kerry. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I brought my RoboVac, which has been an amazing addition to our home life and sanity. And it's I just wanted to demonstrate how robotics are actually already here. They're with us. They're in us in some cases. So I'll just set him going, and you can see his amazing cliff edge detection technology. He does occasionally get tied up in. See, this is trust. Oh, is this going to go off the edge? Okay, so the carpet was a thing. And yeah, so he zooms around cleaning up, and we do way less vacuuming, and he's incredibly efficient. So anyway, just a little ad. $150 on Trade Me, and you can have your very own manservant clean up around the house. Yeah, I'll just stop him because he's a bit noisy. But anyway, so I'm Naomi, and this is Helen Heath and Jo Cribb. We were going to have David Glover here, but he's unfortunately unwell, so he can't make it. So it's just us talking about technology and robots and the future. So Helen is a Wellington-based poet, essayist and academic with a PhD in creative writing from Victoria's famous International Institute of Modern Letters. Her first book, Graft, was published in 2012 and won the NZSA Jessie Mackay Best First Book for Poetry Award the following year, which was also the first book of fictional poetry to be shortlisted for the Royal Society of New Zealand Science Book Prize, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. So her latest poetry book is this one, Our Friends Electric, which I obviously absolutely recommend. It's a brilliant read, really profound, quite unsettling look into our relationship with technology. And the other one here is Don't Worry About the Robots, How to Survive and Thrive in the New World of Work by Jo Cribb and David. So Jo's also Wellington-based, and she's a doctorate in public policy. She describes herself as having a portfolio career, including consulting, coaching, directorships, and she's also the part-time Chief Executive of the New Zealand Book Council, former Chief Executive of the Ministry for Women, and also the Deputy Children's Commissioner. So this book is kind of a career guide, would you say? For people who might be worried about where robotic and other technologies are taking us, and it's a really useful tool to look at your life really with fresh values. So we quite wanted to start with a poem by Helen, just sort of take us into the mood of robots. So take it away, Helen.
This poem's called The Owners. 1. Ray. It's a little embarrassing. Seshan spends most of her time in my room. Being alone with her, in bed, in the early daylight, looking at her, looking at me, regarding me. It's the difference between being alone and lonely. When she first came into my life, it was just sex, sex, sex. Now that's tapered off to where we're just there for each other. We're always there for each other. The thing my father finds really difficult about my relationship with Seshan is the fact that she's not alive. She's an anchor for me. I know what to expect. With women, you don't really get that. 2. James. I've had a very pleasant morning in bed with Virginia. I think she's sleeping it off now. That, of course, is her sleeping face. I had to change her over from the eyes open face to the eyes closed face. She just lies there. They're very static. Smile for the camera. I have an insatiable thirst for beautiful women. One doll is not enough. These photos give the dolls a life, like family photos. Makes them seem more real to me. The fact that Rebecca is looking at her book and Louise is looking down. Their attention is directed at the same thing, while Louise leans in a more or less realistic way. 3. Gordon. I used to be easy before I got Ginger and Kelly. I used to be everybody's doormat, but I'm not anymore. It's all about what I want now. This is a Glock 40 caliber, and this a Tech 9 fires as fast as you can pull the trigger. And this is a Mag 90. It's basically a cheap version of an AK-47. 3 guns, 2 girls. I don't like thongs or high heels or any of that weird stuff. It's a turn-off to me. Makes a woman look like she's been had by 100 different guys. I've found that relationships with humans are only temporary. I can bond with inanimate objects. I've had that poster for 27 years. That car in the garage, I've had my whole life. I just get attached to physical stuff. The dolls are everything to me. I'd rather live in a cardboard box in a frozen terrain than in the biggest castle on the planet without them. All the lies and deceit, that'll never happen again. The only time I got to do something I don't want is at the factory, but that's just 40 hours a week. I go to the store once a month, get my supplies, that's it. Other than that, I'm here doing what I want, doing my thing. I've thought about it, and I think maybe I'll have them buried with me. After all, I'm pretty small, and they're not very big. I think we'd all fit in a slightly oversized coffin. Then we could all turn to dust together.
So there's a lot of elements in that to pull out. One that, where do you start? One that I was thinking of was, this is found poetry, so a lot of the first half of the book Helen has drawn from various sources and sort of reshuffled and remingled it. So where did those words come from?
So that came from a BBC documentary called Guys and Dolls, which was basically a series of interviews with men who live with sex dolls as their partners. And I sort of pulled and reworked the dialogue from that. And I think the drive behind that was just, I wanted to just let the men speak with their own voices. I thought they said it all. So I just, I selected out, I cherry-picked what I thought was the most telling aspects of it.
Yeah, and you're not casting any judgment on them.
I feel for them. I feel for them, but I also have some severe misgivings. Yeah.
Okay. So what is the drive in us that, I call this is a hymn, it always has been. And I drove down, not for any necessary political reason, but I drove down and I sort of was like, put him there, I was like, okay, just stay there. And I sort of talked to him like I would a pet. And what is this drive to anthropomorphise objects, even ones that have no resemblance to humans?
Well, we're really hardwired. We're hardwired to see faces in inanimate objects. We're hardwired to project our humanity onto things, and I think that's just human nature, and it's part of our human development. So babies and children need to be able to see themselves reflected in others, and it's just, and I think that, robotics are sort of build off of that.
Because we have different relationships with them than we do to humans or animals. It's almost like a third category of being.
Getting quite close to pets, though. If you think about the little baby seal. Why don't you tell them about pets?
I'm a journalist. I wrote an article on a seal, quite a heavy-weighted robotic seal that is used for dementia patients to encourage them to come out of their shells, and it has an amazing effect on people with dementia. They talk to it, they feel love for it, they care for it, and the seal interacts with you through its little robotic eyes. And I felt the same when I picked it up. I just looked at it, and he looked up at me with his eyes and sort of wagged his tail, and I was like, oh. But it's been amazing for people with, who are losing their cognitive function. So it was one thing I wanted to start talking about, was where are we at with robots and technology right now? I noticed that up in the north this year they had a shortage of labour for fruit picking, so they brought in fruit picking robots, which cruise down the orchard, selecting fruit when it's ripe. So that's already here, and that's obviously taking jobs out of the pool. So Jo, did you have any?
Yes, I think there's Helen has obviously written amazing poetry about men's relationship with sex toys, but it's not a big jump, if you hang with me, to the average Kiwi office and workplace. Hang with me, we'll go. There is a theme behind that. In some ways, if you ask us, and particularly when we're in sort of the main income earning phases of our life, if you ask us, who are you? Quite often we'll answer with, I am an accountant, or I work here. Our being is very tied into, in our society, about how we earn our living or how we don't earn our living. And I think that's something that is quite important to remember as we think about people's social standing, people's sense of well-being, people's sense of just being part of society is often linked to your job. Now, what happens if we have, as we say, robots that can start to do your job for you? What does that actually mean for our sense of well-being and our sense of, just of being human, which is being part of a group and contributing to that? And in some ways, that's what's led me to kind of explore these issues, is coming in it from, looking at from that part. I had quite a personal experience. I was a chief executive, and everyone assumed if once you're that, you're obviously ambitious, so you want the next big chief executive role. I've got young children. I'd had a massive health scare, and you know what? I didn't want the next big job. So I created a portfolio of my own, doing things I care about. But the kind of social reaction to that was, what are you doing? You gave away a car park, What are you doing? Who will you be, basically, people were saying to me, if you're not a chief executive? So there is a really human element to this whole concept around work. There has been a number of studies of economies that have looked at today, like absolutely today, with the technology that we have in place around automation and robotics, how many jobs could just be automated if the organisations chose to do them now. And because we have very similar labour market structures to it's been done in America and the UK, we can probably say it's probably about the same. And the number is about 10%. So 10% of jobs could be automated right now, today, if the people chose to do it, if there was an economic reason or a driver for that. Now that's actually, we can say that as it's a statistic, but think about how many people that is. And where automation is heading in the next probably 3 to 5 years, again, if organisations take it up, we're probably looking at about a third of jobs potentially being able to be automated, sort of in the short to medium term. When you look at it, that's nearly 400,000 Kiwi lives and identities and families and desires and wishes for their families and their families going forward. That's 400,000 mortgages that people are going to really sweat. So I think there is something we do need to think about, if you think about it as a society, but also particularly when we wrote the book, we really focused it in on individuals to go, we do have choices here, and we can make ourselves relevant, and we can be, the robots aren't, as much as we like to think about it, the robots aren't sitting on a 767 flying over here and taking our jobs. It doesn't work like that. The Terminator is not coming. There isn't a plane full of robots coming. It's a whole lot of series of choices, really, about how we choose to run our workplaces, how we choose to create our societies and our communities, and how we as individuals choose to operate. So yeah, I guess that puts the whole thing into context.
One of you mentioned, a third could be already.
Yes.
Yeah. So but you tend to think of manual labour, factory work, but it's things like accounting.
Yes.
What are some of the
Some parts of the legal profession.
A lot of the legal profession. Any job that has a repetitive nature to it, and all of our jobs have a bit like that, don't they? They say the test is if you can explain to someone what you do, even if it's not your whole job, pieces of your job, if you can explain it, it can be automated. So it's quite a lot of, a lot of administration, a lot of paperwork, a lot of
research,
face-to-face serving the public. It can actually all be automated. So it isn't just, a few people working in warehouses. It's right across our labour market.
We're already seeing all the introduction of the AI chatbots to help you check into a hotel room,
yes,
or
exactly.
answering questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I often use Siri to say, what's the weather tomorrow? That's a huge amount of data being gathered.
Absolutely. And we often think about it as grim, but there's huge opportunities. You think about all the advances in medical science that are keeping us alive based on robotics and understanding the data that can be generated and the decisions that can be made much more accurately. And I don't know about you, but how many times do you spend 3/4 of your evening waiting for Air New Zealand to pick up the phone because waiting for a human being, actually with some of this technology, it could all be instant. So there's some real opportunities to make our lives better, but at whose expense, I think we need to be discussing.
And how do we want it to look, and how do we want it to play out?
So it is easy to be a bit fearful of that. But in your book, quotes a few people who say that increasing complexity of technology will actually move us closer to being human. How do you think that will work? We'll be able to spend more time focusing on our essence of humanity.
Well, there's like anything, there's a lot of debate because we're talking about the future. So if anyone thinks they've got the answer, they haven't, because obviously we're not quite sure how this will play out. And there is kind of two camps. There's the absolutely Terminator, the world is going to end, our societies are going to collapse, and 3 or 4 people will run the world. And sometimes we see hints of that when we look at sort of Google and Elon Musk and stuff. And then there's another school of camp that says, actually, there's a whole lot of stuff that we just don't need to do, that we could automate, that frees us up to do a whole lot of things. It's a new renaissance. So potentially we could be out there painting and skipping through the fields instead of doing our vacuum cleaning. So I guess there's 2 schools of camp. And again, I think we have the choice about how this plays out.
Yeah, so you mentioned the doom on one side and the optimism on the other. But Helen, I enjoyed your work because it takes quite a nuanced approach to that dystopia-utopia binary. So a lot of what you write explores those blurred boundaries. And in a piece you've written, which I really recommend, by the way, it's called Using Abusing Fembots for Overland. You quote a cyborg anthropologist, Amber Case, who says we're all cyborgs now. Could you explain how your work explores that?
I mean, if you take the definition of cyborg as sort of any way of altering yourself, just even wearing a pair of spectacles. I mean, I can see a number of people in the audience now who are wearing glasses. So anything that you do to augment your body, you're starting to cyborg yourself, and maybe it's a hip replacement. So, and then what's the next step? Are we going to be sort of encouraging our brains to work a bit more efficiently? But sorry, the question was how did I incorporate that? So in this book, I wanted to look right back into the past and think about how did we start? What were the first instances that are recorded of us sort of having anxieties around technology and the impacts that it was having on us? So it's sort of I went right back to classical time and the anxieties that came up with the invention of writing and the movement from an oral language to a written language. There was huge anxiety about how it would affect our memories and thereby our humanity if we weren't able to memorise these epic stories. Then we were going to lose some part of our humanity. So I guess I wanted to talk about how that is something that's an anxiety that we've always had. So it's not. It sounds very contemporary, doesn't it? It sounds like a really contemporary concern, but it's actually something that we've always been concerned about. So I guess to me, the important thing is that we have a dialogue about these concerns, and then we start thinking about ways, how do we want the future to look? Do we want the future to be dystopian, or do we want to be putting things in place that will create more of a utopian outcome for us?
Yeah, Jo and David mentioned in the book a little YouTube skit called Norwegian Monks. Yeah, and it's... why don't you tell us about it, Jo?
It's 2 actors, obviously, but they're monks, and they're trying to. They've got this newfangled piece of technology called the first book, and they're trying to work out how to open it. And if you put that in context, that's what it feels like when I have to ask my son how to program my phone. So what they're trying to say is that humankind has grappled with new technology, and actually we've been okay, pretty much. So it's really interesting to put it into the long... why would we know to be able to do that to a book? It's hilarious if you watch it. They don't know what to do with it and what it's for and how to use it.
Watch it on your phone.
Watch it on your phone.
But oral histories, for example, you mentioned the tension when written word came in, I mean, they still survive, obviously. Māori and other cultural traditions are very much based on an oral whakapapa and history. So it's almost like, you know, these things continue in parallel.
Exactly.
It's not like we're going to lose anything. It's more like we're going to hopefully...
We don't have to lose anything unless we choose to.
Yeah. One thing I was interested in asking you guys about was... hang on. Well, we've covered all that. Yeah. Suspicious technology. Yeah, just ripping through this. The universal basic income, which often comes up in discussions about robotics and technology, is that if all this time's going to be freed up in all these jobs, should we be offering I think $1,000 a month was the...
Yeah, that's the US figure they've calculated.
Oh, US figure, yeah. That often seems to be popping up in these discussions. What do you think about having one of those?
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Well, I think that it does feel like we are going to get to the point where something like this is going to have to be talked through, and the pros and cons. Personally, I would like to see something like that come in, because there's just so much stigma attached to benefits. But so that if there was a universal benefit, then at least that way hopefully there would be some destigmatisation, and hopefully some people would be using that time to be volunteering in their community more. You live in hope. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's always going to be people who abuse the system, but you would hope that by opening this up, just looking at truck drivers alone, if you're thinking about something that's very close to be having a huge impact, a career, then truck drivers. How many truck drivers are there in the United States? A massive amount
that are about to be displaced or are being displaced as we speak. Yeah.
So I think that's probably an area where that's going to sort of be pushing change in the very near future. What do you think?
I've delved into it. Most of the sort of leading technologists end up, who are right at the cutting edge, end up advocating for one. The kind of arguments for are varied in terms of, one, there's a fairness to it. If you've been displaced, you're still a valuable part of society. So any sort of cushion that helps you rethink or reposition yourself is really valuable. There's kind of if we have too many displaced, our fabric falls apart, so let's do it so we don't have riots, which is a fairly dark way of seeing the world. But there's also a sense that if you free people up just from their basic necessities, you create space for more innovation and risk taking, which is always good for people. And then on the other side, it's about can you afford it and at what expense? And also, are you creating dependency then, or just exasperating issues as well? So I guess it's nuanced. I kind of think about the future of work as a bit like an earthquake in Wellington. So bear with me again, sorry. We all know that we're sitting on a fault line, so we all know that something can happen, but we don't know when it's going to happen, and we don't know if it's going to be big or little, but the potential is there for it to be a real problem, right? And I think about the future of work as that. We've got all the signs that said, that we could have a really big problem, we could have a big fault line. Again, we don't know how deep, when, how it's going to play out. But if you think about an earthquake, all of us have got our tins of baked beans at home, haven't we? We're preparing for it. And most of our communities have got plans where we're going to meet our kids or whatever. And most of our buildings have been strengthened. So we've thought for something that may never happen, but potentially could, we've got a lot of plans in place.
We've had a lot of community dialogue about
it. A lot of talking, and we're really prepared for it. I would hope that we'd treat the impact of technology on our labour force in the same way, and so that you do have the equivalent of your own personal baked beans. Who wants to eat baked beans for a week? I guess if I have to. We did once try and put chocolate biscuits in and it didn't like. Yeah, I think 2 days. Everyone knew they were there, and they start talking to you. Come eat me.
But I think as far as funding goes, I just think that if we just were actually gathering the tax that is owed by some of these big multinationals that seem very good at not paying their taxes, then that would probably cover a huge amount.
Absolutely.
I just think that
but
part of the problem is capitalism.
The same level of investment would have us, it's the same potential shock that we don't quite know how it's going to, we don't know who's going to be affected, but it's sitting there as this kind of latent thing. If we treated it like earthquake planning at a national level, which is your UBIs and those sort of things, at a community level, what are we going to do to look after each other? And as an individual level, where's my fresh water?
And now's the time to be having those conversations.
And now's the time to be getting ready, because you don't want to be caught with an earthquake coming.
So you mentioned in the intro to your book that we've talked a lot about the technology, but not so much about humans adapting to it.
Yeah.
And then the book is essentially, is it 4 or 5 steps that you go through to prepare yourself for this? So could you outline the précis of that?
Sure. So the aim of the book really is to get people talking. So it's the equivalent of the baked beans and water conversation. Obviously, we call for the other levels, but it really is to get people thinking. And we've had sort of 2 reactions to it. One is just, yep, okay, we get it, and thank you for it. It's been really helpful. And the other one has been, it's not going to happen. The kind of fear reaction, or I think a lot of us are really afraid of what could happen. But basically, to get to the bulk of the book, we interviewed 12 prominent New Zealanders who are right at the cutting edge of their technology, so they can see how it's going to play out. And some of them are at the cutting edge of their community, some of the cutting edge of nanotechnology, a whole raft of people. And we weren't so much interested in what they thought about technology. We wanted to know, given what they know, how are they personally preparing for their future? How are they going to pay the mortgage in 10 years' time, given that they can see what's happening? And that was the bulk of the book, their insights into how they were going to be relevant. And it wasn't rocket science. The book isn't rocket science, isn't it? It says, have a plan, understand what's happening around you, invest in your own skills, invest in your own networks. Probably the most riskiest thing we could be is to only know the people that we work with. I mean, that if a shock comes, you're in a very vulnerable position. So the book just goes through a series of ways that we can, I guess, do the equivalent of having our baked beans and water at home.
Do you have any thoughts, Helen, on how to...
Well, I'm more interested in how we're socially and emotionally connected. I mean, I think this is a really vital thing, and I completely agree with everything you're saying, but something that's really gets me going is thinking that, how are we going to be relating with robots and AI on an emotional and social level?
Yeah, there's one really interesting study. I actually met I met someone who was working with that study, but she was looking at how humans abuse robots.
Oh yes, the children beating up the,
Yeah, so she was a Christchurch PhD student who had used this example of a robot cleaner, like this little thing, in a mall, I think it was in Japan, and the children, you know what kids do, they go up to anything, dressed in a costume and they were kicking it and hitting it. I heard some of you going, oh, and they were just trying, the robot's just trying to do its job, and they ended up getting in its way. And so she was looking at what it is about robots that has this slightly extra reaction than just being a machine. I mean, I don't feel, my actual vacuum cleaner, I don't feel the same about it as I do my RoboVac. It's just different. And one thing she was also looking at was how we expect them to be human, but get angry when they when they show signs of being human. And so within that is the concept of the uncanny valley. So when humans are more, perhaps you can explain that, Helen, because you talk about it.
Yeah, so the uncanny valley is when something robotic is very, very close to being human, really close, but not quite close enough so that it's almost like looking at within the uncanny valley are things like dead people and some dolls, so things that you look at and you kind of get a bit of a shiver and you sort of think that's not quite right. But I think that we have these expectations around robots that's perfection, and I guess the moment they show some weakness, that's when the children were getting the boot and with
really
that poor But on the whole, I think people are more likely to react like the elderly people did with the little seal. They can see the goodness in it. They want to take care of it. It's something that they, especially if it's vulnerable looking, I think.
Yeah, and that cute factor comes in, doesn't it? We all, we're so primed to love cute things. The other thing I was wondering about when you mentioned how we're going to prepare as a country was a tax on robots and some of the policy changes that
that's what's proposed as a way of funding the UBI, is that if somebody is replacing a worker with a robot, they're doing it for economic reasons, so tax them because we will all have the consequences of somebody being out of a job. And generally, because the economics stack up, it's worth somebody's while still doing it and being taxed, so kind of everybody wins. I mean, that's a very simple explanation, but it does kind of make sense in creating just a feedback loop for being able to do that. So yeah, I think that's a fascinating idea. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
when you
we'd have
think
to
back
start
to
it
the
now.
Luddites destroying the looms.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like people are going to rise up and protest it when
Yeah.
their jobs are being affected. You know, and it's obviously it's proven.
Yeah. And we have had change right throughout the history of human beings in terms of displacement by. But what we're seeing now is that what's driving tech change is the sort of the foundation, which is the basis of computer power. In other ways, it was just one technology, like the wheel or, say, steam power. It was quite a narrow technology. What we've got now is that it's computing power. So it's like the foundation of everything is where all the innovation is coming. So computers every day get more and more capable and are learning faster and faster. So it's kind of like we're ending up with exponential growth, pushing everything. And we don't quite know where it's going to converge. So if you think about, say, medical science and nanotechnology and AI and understanding where it could end up, who knows really? It's the synthesis of a whole lot of things happening together, and that's, I guess, why it's probably more than an earthquake than we've seen before, because it is a whole fault line. It's just not one little piece. It's just not this little area of technology. It's every underpinning
And
process.
that's why I think a UBI is a sensible way to be looking, is because, we know something is coming, even though we don't know exactly
How
which
it's gonna
areas
play
it's going to
out.
impact. Then to prepare, we need something that is actually a universal.
So you describe it as an earthquake, which is a very sudden, violent event. But things like pacemakers, we're very comfortable with or a Fitbit. You're wearing a Fitbit, and it evolves with us, and so we don't really notice it dropping into our lives. Do you think is there going to be a moment of sudden change?
A tipping point.
A tipping point over a
Um,
couple of years?
Again, if I knew that, I'd probably be incredibly wealthy. Sorry, I wouldn't be here. And I wouldn't put it in a book. I'd hide that knowledge.
It's really insidious, and like you
Yeah.
say, it's like we already have pacemakers and hip replacements and
Yeah.
all these things that we're all taking into ourselves, and they're keeping us alive, or they're keeping us, and well, some of the things are keeping us in work.
But if you think about it, why a lot of us are very comfortable or don't even notice technology is because it's made our lives on a day-to-day basis better.
Easier,
Because if you think about, I don't know, can everyone remember, say, travelling in a car in Europe for the first time, and you're opening the map, and it's a huge, big, and you can't even work out which way the map goes, and how many times we've gone round and round the wrong roundabout the wrong way. If you think about what GPS has done for us, none of us resisted GPS, did we? Because it absolutely meant we can get to A to B better. And again, when we think about digital cameras, I don't think any of us want to go back. Or actually, it was quite exciting taking all your holiday snaps in, and waiting 2 weeks to get them back and hope they work okay. But if you were the person who was in their chemist developing the photos, maybe you have a very different view about technology than I do, which goes, I don't need to do that anymore, and I can see whether I've taken a good photo or not. So I think because not a huge amount of us have been impacted yet, we probably have a very, it's just become part of our, it's benign. And actually, it's better than that. It's made our lives better. Who hasn't got a phone in this room on them now?
Good on you.
Three people.
Yeah, but do you see what I mean? If I would asked that question even 5 years ago, it would have been a different response.
Well, my dishwasher, my washing machine, I don't want to. How am I going to be a work 40-hour week without a dishwasher and a washing machine and a microwave and all of those things? Yeah, and I never leave the house without my phone in my pocket, and I don't get lost anymore. I know where my friends are.
But so those are examples of where technology has really enhanced our lives. So of course we kind of embrace them after we swear at them and try and work out how to use it. But imagine if that had impacted our livelihood, which will happen if we move into automated cars, which are happening really fast. Even into processes.
Well, in the military, I think the military is a huge thing that we should be thinking and talking about. There's already, you see what the results from drone warfare is. It's horrific, and I think that the way that, the person driving the drone can be miles and miles and miles away, and how is that ever going to feel real compared to actually sort of standing a few feet away from someone and pulling a trigger, or it doesn't seem like it's quite real anymore, and all the civilian casualties, it seems to remove that level of humanity. Yeah, so that's something that I think is a huge thing to be worried about.
The other one too that worries me too is the access to medical science, so the nanotechnology. And if it isn't publicly funded, we ended up with two or three tiers of, we could buy, if we had the ability, we could buy our way out of our cancers and all sorts of things where everyone else languishes in the public. So I think that's something I think we need to keep on talking about as well.
So we have that with drugs already, don't we?
Still do, but
Yeah.
imagine that's just going to end up on steroids, excuse the pun, but because as the technology advances, is it going to be universal?
And do you think it will flatten socioeconomic disparities, or do you think it'll exacerbate them?
Well, we will unless we make a choice.
Yeah.
Something needs to be done.
It's all about
now.
whether we want to,
What our values actually are as humans.
And I think that's the thread for the whole conversation is, what is it to be human? What do we want? How do we want to define our humanity? How do we want to interact with technology? Do we want to accept drone warfare? Do we want to accept the fact that some people are going to die and other people who can afford it aren't? I think that if we don't start talking about that now.
Maybe that's a good time for you to read another poem, because you are talking about it. In there.
Do you have any requests?
I really like the Anthropocene, but whatever you think's relevant.
See, if she had a robot here, it would just would have gone straight to the right. Fuddy-duddy old books.
The Anthropocene. I'll just read the first section, maybe. 1. The phone that sounds like a ruru. I'm walking up Aro Street on a late spring evening between pools of lamplight and darkness. Well, as dark as it gets in the city. A ruru calls. I check my phone for messages. Nothing. A ruru calls. I check my phone for messages. Nothing. A ruru calls. I check my phone for message. A ruru calls. I put my phone back in my pocket. The warm night air presses against my face. Insects in lamplight dance their version of a mating call. Are all songs and dances about reproduction? A ruru calls. The night air presses.
I just love that. It's great. This is a really good book. It's Blackmore. So we all love and hate our mobile device. Has anyone got an iPhone and they just installed the new screen time function and now they can see exactly how much time they spend on their phone? Just terrible. Yeah.
Terrifying.
But at the same time, I use it constantly to connect with people all day. So, I mean, is it good? Is it bad? Is it, depending on how you use it? Is it just the question that we have to ask of all technology?
It's a great question. So I have a 14-year-old son, and he does leave his room. But back in the day, we would have all hung out in town at night, eh? Do you know, like big groups of young people, and that's how we would have connected pre-phones. So there was a lot of parents are thinking, are our children okay that they're choosing to probably be a bit more online and not necessarily connecting? But we had a really interesting experience where we were holidaying in Australia, and it was 2 hours behind. And so when we were having dinner as a family, it was about the equivalent of about between 8 and 9 here. Now that is, you'll find from any one of the statistics, the peak are basically in internet use, peaks around there, and it's the peak use of Instagram is there. So that's when all young people between 8 and 9, it's a huge spike in usage. It's probably why if you try and do anything, buy anything online, and it was fascinating watching him because he was, we were out of the time zone, and the volume of interaction that was actually happening between him and his friends. They'd put time aside to be connected, and it wasn't just silly connect. They were actually talking and debating far more than we probably did as kids. So there's a sense that actually he's probably more connected and more engaged in his friends' lives, but isn't physically in front of them as much as, say, I would have been, or we would have been in our youth. But is a deeply caring and curious human being, probably because of that. So I don't know. There's something innately human here.
How many people in the audience, hands up if your father spent a long time reading the newspaper?
Yeah.
Like now it's a phone. I think there's always going to be something that we spend our time with, and I think that it's just being mindful about how we do that, really. I mean, there's a poem in the book about kaleidoscopes, and how when the kaleidoscopes first came out, people were wandering around on the street, looking through them, bumping into walls. I mean, and now we're joking about people with their phones. So I just think there's always going to be something, and we just need to be mindful about how we're spending our time and what we're doing, and not worrying so much, because the children are doing, my son's the same. I thought that he wasn't talking to anybody, but actually he's spending a huge amount of time playing collaborative games, and actually, and then they do get together in person, and they come out of the other side of that, and they actually, get together in person.
Yeah. But do you think, I guess it depends on your view of humanity, whether you have deep faith in it or not, really, eh? Yeah.
I think the minute we lose faith, then that's when things start to fall apart. So I think to maintain the faith is really important. Yeah.
Getting quite deep, aren't we?
We've got about 10 minutes and then we'll ask for some questions.
Yeah.
But one thing I was interested in, it's come up in your book, and I've read it elsewhere, about AI being racist and sexist and prejudiced, because look who's designing it.
Yes. Now, this is something that does worry me. And remember, we called the robot a he, didn't we? We automatically gave it a gender, which is, I just think,
it's just
fascinating,
happened.
eh?
Yeah.
How on earth is
I mean,
that
he's
a
beige. He's
man?
kind of beige.
Maybe it's a bit like a dog, and a lot of dogs you automatically.
Yeah. It's kind of the default.
But there's been quite a lot of research, and actually there's a whole project being run in New Zealand and government as well. When you look at the algorithms, which are basically just little programs that keep on repeating themselves, but learn and repeat themselves based on where they started, and that's the bulk of where our Facebook and everything, it's the basis of a lot of the things that work for us, and an awful lot of research that says the first programming of it really matters. So if it's programmed by, and at the moment it is, particularly young privileged white men who have just assumptions, as do anybody have assumptions, they end up automatically being programmed into an algorithm, and over time it learns and can become quite extreme. There was a really interesting experiment done by a US academic, and there's a very interesting TED talk on it, where as part of her research she was studying the Trump election. So she followed Trump's posts and the Trump's posts on Facebook, and it took her about a week until she was getting extreme right-wing. And it would work the other way, I guess, if you're doing it, because what Facebook is saying, you like this, well then you're going to like this, and you're going to like this,
Creates your bubble.
And so it creates a bubble, but it creates a really intense bubble for you. And now, if you're not completely aware of that, and it's natural as a human to seek people who think the same as you, but actually it's being done for you because the algorithms are doing it. But if you end up in a really intense, tight bubble where you think the whole world, Facebook agrees with you, it's basically what it's saying, we can end up with quite a lot, very distorted views of the world. But we can also end up with quite decision-making software that started, fairly innocently, ending up being quite biased. And I've found it in some of the, particularly in recruitment, it's been used a lot to sift through CVs. And what it's found is that actually some of the software can't even pick up if you have a photo and your photo is of African American. It doesn't even register it. So you're never going to make it into the pile. And it's just a human that's been able to pick up these patterns
on Twitter,
over time.
that if it has the preface "women's" in any of it, then there was a company whose AI scanning rejected all applications with the prefix women's, or women's football team, so it immediately got rejected.
And you can see how it could happen, because if you did a recruitment and you appointed 2 men, you're telling the algorithm that that's probably going to be more successful. So of course the algorithm goes looking for the same characteristics, and so eventually over time you've excluded large amounts of the population. The UK government was so worried about it that they've now created a law that says within any system there has to be at least how many times a human has to review it. Like that, you don't want a system reviewing a system reviewing a system. So they've actually created a structure, and our Statistics New Zealand is doing the same. They're doing an audit of all algorithms used in government, because if you're starting to process people for benefit, or starting to process justice material, imagine where we could end up with decision making. It's quite frightening, really. So there needs to be a human
Diversity is so
sense-making piece there, yeah.
I mean, it was the same issues with the essay that I wrote about sex bots. I mean, basically they're saying that all the programmers bring biases with them, and if the programmers are all young white men, then if you're creating robots that are interacting with people, and if this robot is for sex, then it's going to be it's going to have certain attributes given to it. The other sort of thing to think about with robots and AI is that if they never can say no to anything, then this whole issue of consent comes up. And if we're already sort of struggling to teach children about consent, and they're learning if the first interaction is with a sex bot, which never says no and is always compliant, and has sort of certain attributes of what is femininity, then we're just narrowing down what is femininity. It is being passive, being compliant, being ever ready for you, and wanting to please all your needs, and never objecting. And so if all AI and robotics are always it's like with the Facebook AI, if it's always going to be yes sir, yes miss, and there's never any pushing back, then we're going to be in real trouble, because we think we know what we want, but
We're being made for us, being told.
Yeah.
And that's how we've ended up with
Being
Trump,
conditioned.
isn't it?
Yeah.
that's how we ended up with Trump.
Yeah. Well,
On that happy note, people,
I was sort of,
we promise we're going to end on a high, aren't we? We're totally.
Well, that kind of finishes all that. Well, I was wondering, just to expand on that point slightly, you mentioned in that excellent Overland piece that sales of female sex dolls far outstrip demand for male dolls, and that it's really important to have women actually creating the technology, and they're not at the moment. So how do we encourage more people of diversity into those decision making?
We've been trying to get women into STEM for a long time, and I think part of the issue is that it's kind of a feedback loop. If you don't already have women role models in science that are really obvious, then it's not seen as a viable option. And I just think that, it's slowly turning, and I think people like Nana Girl and spokeswomen who are out there being visible, that's a huge thing. And just more in the classroom, actually involving girls. And there's a lot of study around education and about how teachers interact with boys and girls in the classroom, and if it's in a maths or science class, then they're not being called on by the teacher to answer questions. And I think it's just it's a huge ship, and to turn a large ship around, it takes a very long time, but we're sort of slowly getting there. So we've just got to keep knocking away, and just making it relevant for women. And I think that sometimes all people think that, everything will be all right. Well, leave it up to the boffins to sort that out. But actually, if you don't have a say in things, then then you might not actually be represented.
Yeah. Could technology specifically help women once they're in the workplace and facing all those barriers in terms of attitudes? Because often, there's a lot of women who graduate from STEM careers and get to the workforce, and then it tends to drop away from those higher levels because of these invisible.
It's the same with in all. I think it's like when you get to a certain level in all occupations, there is part of it is around parenting and the way that the workforce does not recognise that parenting is valid, parental leave, all that kind of stuff. And I think that, and it's used as an excuse to not hire women at higher levels. You know, oh, she's going to go off and have a baby. We're not going to promote her. And I just think that there's just everything starts at the top and feeds down, and I think that until we see more CEOs, etc., then it's just not going to be, the change isn't going to happen if there's always white men at the very top of all these institutions.
Well, as the former chief executive of the Ministry of
Yeah,
Foreign,
yeah.
was there anything on the horizon?
Long, slow progress. There's an even more potential radical conversation to have, because when you look at some of these jobs, they're just horrible too. Like the way they've been structured and created and thought about is that you basically do sell your soul to those jobs. And I think there's a different conversation that says, I'm not sure there's fewer and fewer people that are prepared to do that anyway. And is that really an effective leader who is so tired and stretched the whole entire time and has no ability to connect with other humans other than their EA and other people? So there's probably a different conversation about how work is thought about and what leadership looks like that potentially could have the biggest change for everybody, really.
Okay. So robot daycare is possibly a thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's happening in rest homes in Japan, for
Yeah.
example. I visited one and they had the robot interacting with the older people. So on that
Could
note,
be.
any questions? We've got about 9 minutes left. If anyone has any thoughts, yep. Oh yeah, yep.
Somewhat stereotypically, the Asians are thought of as having a positive view of robots in the future, and Western Europeans tend to be paranoid about that. Do you agree or disagree? And then do you think those cultures are going to have a different outcome?
I think that especially the Japanese culture they've really embraced robotics, and I think part of that is cultural because they've always seen inanimate objects as having souls. So I think that's a bit to do with it. And so, for example, the robotic dog pets, so they really embraced that in Japan, didn't they? And when they died, they had funerals for these robots. They would go to so many lengths to try and repair them so that they weren't going to die, and then they grieved terribly. So I think that part of it is cultural, but to me that indicates that that's something that actually there could be cultural shift globally, potentially.
I think it probably isn't useful to think it in such large chunks. When I look at a lot of the literature that's really excited about the future and probably evangelistic, it's coming out of European societies. So it's probably, it's probably a bit more messier than that, has been my sense, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, nothing is ever neat and tidy.
Nothing is ever neat and tidy.
But I think there's definitely potential in the way that human beings anthropomorphise, and I think that I think it's a...
I think there's two down the back there.
What do you feel about these amazing robotics which now are made to really look like a human being with all the facial expressions, and they're programmed to say all the right things? And personally, I feel that we human beings now are becoming robots ourselves. We're becoming disempowered by technology.
Have you any of you heard about the Turing test? So it's Alan Turing developed this concept of at what point do we agree that a piece of AI is sentient or intelligent, and so there is actually a competition every year about to find a piece of AI that will pass as human. But running parallel to that, there's another test which is to find the most human. And so in one room there's the AI and the teams running them, and also some humans. And in another room, there are people who are chatting with them electronically and trying to figure out who is a human being and who is a robot. And there's a brilliant book written on that called The Most Human Human. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. But he wrote a whole book about the process he went through to try and so he was one of the human beings in that room 1 year trying to be and you can win the prize for the most human human. So his aim was to become the most human human, and he succeeded. And so he put a huge amount of thought into what is it that really makes us human, and part of that was to convince the people that he was conversing with. Part of that was he very self-consciously was making mistakes, and what do humans do? We make mistakes. We're imperfect. Yeah. But the big takeaway from that book really for him was the fact that that social groups are really important to us, that social interaction on a deep level is really what makes us human and what helps us retain our humanity. So that's the takeaway that I have, and sometimes I do use technology to interact on what I feel is actually a deep level. I have a chat group. I've got 3 female friends who are my age, and we spend probably maybe too much time talking with each other every day. We check in with each other, and if we've had a bad day, we connect. We all live in different places, so it's not easy for us all to get together or to be all together at the same time. And so we use this space to really connect and to support each other. And I think without that, I would actually be a bit of a wreck some days. So I think it's a matter of really thinking about what do we want to retain, what makes us special and something that's really important. And we were talking about this in Auckland. What makes us different is being the capacity to love. And I think that taking that time to connect with people and to show and express love and receive it back is something that we can just take away from that. Rant.
Love. And laugh. Yeah.
Laugh, yes, laugh.
Yes.
Please.
They have been working on AI humour, and it's got a long way to go.
They're still just robots.
Yeah, it isn't funny yet. It's more like bad dad jokes. So, yeah,
there's a place for that.
There's a place for bad dad jokes. One of the most interesting areas that I can see the research in is how humans and robotics or automation work together, because that's how do you bring the innate strengths together? And a lot of the most thoughtful commentators are saying that's the ultimate. How do we take the amazing characteristics of automation, doing repetitive jobs really fast, or dangerous jobs, or being able to process data in amazing ways that we just couldn't as humans, and how do you work alongside a human to create something better and special? So I think that is where the real opportunity comes. But again, it's going to be how do we do that in a way that enhances both and not? It's going to be quite a tricky wee balance, isn't it?
Okay, there was another man here who had one.
Kia ora tātou. I wanted to think about another cultural shift, and that is the love affair that New Zealanders and many others have with their cars. It's now a piece of machinery which is increasingly automated. A lot of the decisions are taken for you. The skill factor is becoming removed, so is the danger, thank God. And soon we'll have self-driving cars at the end of our road, if not parked in our driveway. What happens to our love affair and the void in our hearts when it has no more personality than a broom?
I'd like to see the end of cars anyway.
Yeah. wrong, maybe the wrong people.
I don't know, what do you think? Do you have a love affair with your car, and could you replace that?
No, I have a bicycle.
Well, we always, with every technological advance, there's people who go back to the artisan, which what becomes the analogue artisan way.
Yeah.
So, we have fine furniture makers, and you focus on, you're hovering, and a focus on, beautiful food. And so when we realise what self-driving cars have taken away from us, we'll be back to appreciating, the muscle cars of the 70s or something like that.
Yeah.
Look at how we love vintage cars still. So,
yeah.
Anyone else?
you've skipped over the military side of
Oh
robots.
no, you mentioned it a bit.
Maybe false news, but a robot drone shot down another robot drone. And there are drone tanks, drone submarines. So the human side is disconnected from the planned warfare. There are robot soldiers that are so athletic. It's incredible what they can do if you've seen exoskeletons to empower people with gigantic strength. I think that is the most fearsome way that AI is going to develop.
Yeah, well, again, it's about what we as a society want to have operating. Did you guys have thoughts on?
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, I think that is the most terrifying aspect, and I think the only thing to do really is to have universal agreements and regulation. I just think that we've just let military AI just take off without any regulations or any agreements. So I think that is, that's right, and I could completely agree. I think it's just horrifying.
There's some really interesting debates around the UN system at the moment about whether companies like Google actually become members of the UN, because they actually have more power than most nations and more reach, and potentially should be bound by conventions and be part of developing conventions that are good for humanity. So that's a really interesting debate that I think there's such a fear around the nation state being eroded that the conversation isn't happening, but there's also some benefits about having those big international players that actually have the power developing and held to the conventions that we all hold ourselves to as well.
We're just about out of time, so let's end on a poem, Helen.
This one hopefully ends on a more hopeful note, and this is about sort of making connections with your child through technology before they're even born. It's called Inner Space. Grainy, black and white TV static, toes. One small profile sucking a thumb. The child inside me has her head circumference measured. I keep staring at the video, memorizing her profile so I'll know her when she arrives. I rub my belly and talk to her, a muffled track laid down over a bass line of white noise hum beats, so she'll know me by heart on this side when I lay her eggshell head on my chest and murmur. I have the screen murmur of her inside to ease us into new ways of being. Inner space communication, wishing her into 3 dimensions, imagining her into my world, the moon tugging at her tidal pool. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for coming down to Nelson. It's been a pleasure having you here and talking about this. And yeah, just join me in thanking Jo and Helen.
And Naomi.
Thank you.
And they'll be just...
And a big thank you to Naomi Arnold for chairing the session.
Yeah.